Hello, everybody. Welcome to another webinar by the MedMA. Thank you all for being here, and thanks to our participants for accepting our invitation. I am Eleni Takov, a senior research and policy advisor of the Mediterranean Migration and Asylum Policy Hub, and I'm very happy to be moderating this discussion. When we set out to establish MedMA about 3 years ago, one of the main concerns we had was that so much of the policy making on asylum and migration management was driven more by assumptions than by, let's say, solid facts and evidence. And that is linked not only to, the massive spread of fake news, misinformation, disinformation around migration, but it is also linked to a much simpler and just as worrying phenomenon, which is that a large part of migration policy is still under-researched and under-analyzed. We believe that secondary or onward movements, however you call them, of beneficiaries of international protection is one of those areas. So in this regard, it is a real pleasure to be with you today for this webinar, where we'll be discussing MedMA's latest policy paper entitled Secondary Movements of Beneficiaries of International Protection from Greece to the Netherlands. So before I give the floor to the author of the report, Mr. Tihomir Sabchev, to present the findings, I would like to invite our director, Markus Engler, to open the floor with a few introductory remarks. Markus, over to you.
Thank you so much, Eleni. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Tihomir Sabchev for his great work, as well as our commentators today, Markus and Kristin, and of course, all of you joining this afternoon to discuss the paper. As Eleni mentioned, the Mediterranean Migration and Asylum Policy Hub, or MedMA, as we call it, was established in 2022 as part of the European Public Law Organization to advance a, let's say, Mediterranean evidence-based approach to migration governance. We see migration as a driver for social cohesion, economic development. But we also feel that a lot more insight needs to be garnered into migrant journeys and mobility from the perspective of Mediterranean or frontline member states, as they are called. So it is only natural that one of the key questions that we wanted answered as part of our, let's say, in-house research leg of the work that we do is related to secondary movement or onward movement of beneficiaries. Tiho has done all the legwork and will be presenting the findings. From my perspective, just a few introductory remarks. The issue has been very high on the political agenda. It has dominated bilateral meetings between Greek officials and officials of the EU member states, especially since 2021, when the issue came to the fore, first on a bilateral Greece-Germany basis, and in 2021 we had also a letter of a declaration of intent by the then ministers Seehofer and Mitaraki, but we also had a letter of 6 states, EU plus states, as Switzerland was also included, to the Commission to raise the issue of onward movements of beneficiaries from Greece to other member states. This issue has generated friction, political friction. Obviously, onward movement places pressure on the systems of destination states, since asylum applications are lodged anew there. They create also operational issues as to essentially whether to deal with these applications in truncated admissibility procedures. Onward movement raises, of course, legal issues, and this is part of the heart of the matter, where a lot of the efforts to readmit these refugees that have moved from Greece onwards the efforts have stumbled against legal challenges in the destination countries, especially Germany and the Netherlands, with national courts having to judge on whether readmission, so practically the return of refugees from another member state to Greece as the country that has granted them status, would entail a risk of violation of the prohibition of inhuman and degrading treatment due to the conditions existing right now in Greece and the prospects for refugees to become integrated in the Greek society. So political pressure, operational pressure, legal challenges, but also a political discussion that's built upon assumptions. And somehow we felt that these assumptions are not validated by data, by qualitative analysis. So we reached out to Dr. Sabchev and asked him to cooperate with MedMA to produce this report, which focuses on refugees recognized in Greece who then chose to move onwards to the Netherlands and file for asylum there. I would like to stop here. There's many interesting findings that append some of our thinking on the matter, but I would like to, without further give the floor to Dr. Tihomir Sabchev to take us through the report, the methodology, and the findings. And again, thanks to everyone for joining. Thank you.
Thank you, Markus. Thank you so much for the introductory remarks. So before I give the floor to Dr. Tihomir Sabchev, who is a postdoctoral researcher at Tilburg University, among many other things, of course, I just wanted to make a comment of housekeeping. There is for all the people that are with us in this webinar, there is a chat section and the Q&A section. So we'll try to keep this as interactive as possible. Please feel free to use either channel for comments or questions. And we will, after the first round, we will make sure that every comment or question is addressed by our fellow panelists. So over to you, Tihomir.
Thank you so much, Eleni. I will share some slides that I have prepared for today's meeting. And in the meantime, I would like to thank, of course, MedMA for the productive collaboration that we had. And also, of course, all of you who found the time today to join the webinar and also for your interest in the topic. Now, over the last 8 years, approximately, I've been working on a number of research projects, studying reception, asylum, integration policies in different countries in the Mediterranean region. But primarily, I have been focused on Greece. And as you understand, none of the studies that I and my colleagues do occurs out of nothing, of course. It has some background based on which we develop our initial ideas and questions. And in this specific case, together with Markus Engler, who is one of our discussants today, we worked for the last couple of years on an article that looked into the secondary movements of beneficiaries of international protection from Greece to other EU countries. This was purely from an institutional perspective. So our findings there suggested that legal and policy changes in Greece had caused the general increase of secondary movements that Markus mentioned in the beginning. Importantly, however, we did not include there the perspective of BIPs themselves, which is arguably the most important to understand these dynamics. So for this reason, this report comes to add this missing element to the general puzzle. And it is based, as Markus said in the beginning, on the perspective of people who arrived in Greece, applied for asylum there, who received international protection there, and then traveled to the Netherlands and applied anew for asylum. So to understand their secondary movement, we asked them 3 main questions. First, when did they take the decision to move from Greece to the Netherlands? Second, what factors contributed to their decision to move onward, and if the situation they faced in Greece influenced their decision? And finally, why did they choose to move specifically to the Netherlands? Before showing you the results, let me say a few words on how we conducted the research. So we conducted a qualitative study based on semi-structured interviews with beneficiaries from Greece who had traveled and applied for protection here. I did 13 in-person interviews with a total of 14 individuals who resided in reception centers in 5 different cities in the Netherlands. The interviews were conducted mostly last year, so between December 2024 and August 2025. And the final sample that we had was quite diverse. We had people from Afghanistan, from Syria, from Yemen, from Palestine, Iran, and so on. Almost all of them had received protection in Greece between 2023 and 2025. And despite this relative heterogeneity that we see in terms of countries of origin, we reached data saturation quite early in the analysis, which means that there was no emergence of new information or themes, and the new participants that we were recruiting were just raising the same issues over and over again as the previous ones. And this is indicative for the salience of the findings that I'm going to show you in a minute. Nevertheless, I have to acknowledge that expanding further the relatively small sample that we have, especially in terms of interviewing single women or families of BIPs, may result in some additional novel findings. Now, moving to the results, I will start with the answer to the first question that we posed, namely, when do BIPs take the decision to move from Greece to the Netherlands? Here we have 2 major findings. First, nearly all participants in our research took the decision to move onward while they were in Greece, and more specifically, after they had received international protection there. Only one of our participants actually had decided to go to the Netherlands already when he had started his journey from his country of origin, and he had applied for asylum in Greece only because he was apprehended while crossing into the country. 2 other participants also did have originally the intention to go elsewhere, but then decided nevertheless to give Greece a chance, as they said, but eventually changed their mind after realizing that their intention to settle there wouldn't work out. Second, it's also important to look at how long after one receives protection one decides to depart. In this respect, our findings show that the most of our participants took the decision to move onward shortly after they had exited the Greek reception system and had received their refugee passports. And when I say shortly after, I mean here between a few days and a couple of weeks. BIPs would usually travel from the Aegean Islands to Athens or Thessaloniki, where they would lack local networks, they would feel lost, unable to find their way, and eventually would head towards the airport. And that said, there were also several participants in our study who did spend a relatively longer period in Greece before they decided to eventually leave. These BIPs usually struggled for a few months with housing insecurity, precarious working conditions, including, for example, being exploited, not being paid, etc., which eventually brought them to some kind of despair, which then translated into the same, taking the way to the airport. So in conclusion here, most BIPs in our study would decide to leave Greece only when they have already been in the country and usually shortly after they have received international protection there and their travel documents. This means that they were not fixated on some imagined greener pastures in Western Europe, as the common misconception goes. And this is extremely important, in my opinion, to understand from the very beginning. Now, moving to the second question, we have to focus also on not only on when they decide to leave, but on why they decide to leave. And in this respect, we identified 2 major factors. On the one hand, the adverse reception conditions in Greece, and on the other hand, the lack of integration support there. When it comes to adverse reception conditions, nearly all of the participants that we spoke with described to us the situation in the closed controlled access centers, on the Aegean Islands as overcrowded, unhygienic, lacking sufficient electricity, running water, essential items such as blankets, mattresses, poor quality of the food, all these adverse conditions that you probably have heard about. Not receiving, for instance, their monthly allowance that in theory they are entitled to. Apart from the material conditions, there was also a lot of discussion about and references about the conduct of the authorities and the staff in the centers. So BIPs described, for example, cases where they would be berated by police officers or security staff, or they would be regularly ignored when they try to ask for information. When it comes to the second point, the lack of integration, the most often cited issue here was the so-called 30-day rule, according to which one must leave the reception center where he resides within 30 days of being notified of the positive decision of their application. This rule puts people in very precarious situation, as it was nearly impossible to find alternative housing in this short time frame, as you understand. And the only integration program in Greece, Helios, was described by our participants as dysfunctional by those who were familiar with it. And some of them were actually completely unaware of it, which is not a surprise, of course, because the program in the period that we studied indeed had presented some substantial difficulties and also interruptions. Lastly, BIPs also mentioned the general lack of social assistance in Greece, the lack of protections for those who are employed, the challenges in accessing education, medical help, and extremely difficult procedure that rendered obtaining Greek citizenship almost out of reach. So overall, in this respect, there are two important takeaways in my view in relation to the factors that make BIPs leave. The first takeaway, the decision is taken based on not one, but multiple factors. It's not that I'll be given bad food, for example, in a reception center, and I would say Greece is not for me, I'll go to the Netherlands. No, it is a multitude of factors pertaining mostly to these two domains, but also to some other less, important aspects of the life of people there, including, for instance, feeling unsafe, cases of racism, individual cases of discrimination, etc. And the second takeaway is that it is important to look at the entire experience of the individuals from the arrival to the departure and not compartmentalize it. So not to think separately for the individual as an asylum seeker on the one hand, and then as a BIP on the other. This is extremely important in order to make some comprehensive policy reforms. Having clarified when and why BIPs decide to leave Greece, now it's time to answer why they choose specifically the Netherlands. And the first thing to acknowledge here is that the decision to come to the Netherlands was anything but straightforward for most of the participants who had considered multiple options like Germany, like UK, like the Netherlands, France, and so on. As in the case of the reasons that made them leave Greece, the reasons to choose the Netherlands were multiple and complex, but also can be divided in two broad categories. Reasons that pertain to the specific Dutch reception and integration policies, and reasons related to the broader socioeconomic factors. On the one hand, in relation to Dutch reception and integration policies, BIPs commonly would mention guaranteed accommodation during the asylum procedure, guaranteed housing upon eventual recognition, integration support, specifically the institutional help that is provided here in terms of learning Dutch, pursuing studies, finding trainings, finding employment, but also a stable path towards obtaining citizenship. In terms of broader socioeconomic factors, BIPs would commonly speak to us about the Netherlands as a country where one could unfold their potential in the long term, having some kind of meritocratic undercurrent in their descriptions. So, for example, they would say, I know that it is a place where if I work hard, then I will be able to build a future for me and for my family. What I give to the country will give back to me. Again, there are two important takeaways here. First, the reasons that I just described were based on BIP's perceptions about the Netherlands. And very often these perceptions are based on incomplete or inaccurate information, which led to misconceptions about the Dutch policies and the broader socioeconomic prospects that one may have in the Netherlands. And second takeaway, in contrast to our expectation and the general expectation based on the literature that social networks in the destination country would act somehow as a magnet, we found that family and friends rarely were a crucial factor influencing BIP's decision to move to the Netherlands. Such networks existed. They provided some information, which, as I said, was inaccurate at times, rather than any practical support. So people going to live with their friends or families or something like that. And in fact, some people in our study who choose to move to the Netherlands even had relatives in other European countries, and they decided not to go there. So this underlines the importance, again, of the complexity of the matter that need to understand for policymaking. Before jumping to the conclusions, I want to briefly add a few points which are important in my view, and they came up in our study when we asked BIPs to reflect upon their decision to leave their status in Greece and apply anew for asylum in the Netherlands. First, for most BIPs, this was not an easy decision because it meant going again through the asylum procedure, through pressure, through uncertainty, even for some through the fear of being sent back to their home country. Second, BIPs also were genuinely disappointed with the lengthy processing time in the Netherlands, which they didn't expect. Remember the inaccurate information they were receiving. So some of them had waited 13, 15, more than 20 months for their asylum decision in the Netherlands, and they still didn't have it. And yet, many of our participants claimed that regardless of this predicament, their situation in the Netherlands still was preferable to the alternative of returning to Greece. Lastly, one intriguing finding is that most of our participants stated that they would have stayed in Greece if they had received adequate integration support there, including help with finding accommodation, employment, learning Greek, opportunities to continue one's studies, or having a stable path to citizenship. So from an institutional perspective, I would say they would claim that if Greece offered what the Netherlands offers us in terms of integration support, which is more or less the provisions of the qualification directive, they would have stayed in Greece. Now, to wrap it all up, our report shows that the secondary movement of BIPs from Greece to the Netherlands, and this is my view, can be extended also to other countries, can be interpreted as both a structural phenomenon and a Greek particularity. On the one hand, there will always be, of course, individuals who, for one reason or the other, want to move to a specific country, and they will try to do so regardless of the policy framework in place. Their decision can be driven by personal preferences, family links, notable socioeconomic discrepancies between EU member states, and so on. On the other hand, however, the secondary movement of BIPs are clearly also driven by the adverse institutional welcome, let's call it that, people receive in Greece in relation specifically to the reception conditions and the lack of integration support. So policy-wise, it is clear, at least to me, that one must simultaneously address both these dimensions. How do we do this? For the first part, 3 decades of common European asylum system reforms shows that deterrence-oriented approaches do not work. One must rather think pragmatically. And for example, we should ask ourselves, what does the implementation of the temporary protection directive in the case of Ukrainians teach us? People being able to move and choose a destination on their own when they have protection. In times of labor shortages, aren't we going to benefit from more flexible rules for BIPs who may be offered employment or study opportunities in different EU countries, for example? Or can we use the current recast of the long-term residence directive or the solidarity mechanism that the pact foresees to improve the situation? I think that we can do that. And what about the Greek idiosyncrasy? Well, what needs to be done there appears rather self-evident in terms of reception conditions, but also in terms of integration support. because it is also rather paradoxical in my view that Greece struggles to recruit labor from third countries at the moment, while beneficiaries of international protection who have labor rights there are leaving the country en masse. And on a final note, if we do follow this pragmatic and realistic, I would say, route at both fronts, it would benefit, in my view, everyone. So it would benefit BIPs who would be able to build their life in Greece if they would like to do so, or alternatively pursue studies or careers in another member state if they have the respective opportunity. It would benefit member states by replacing the current conflict-ridden system with one where BIPs are actually valued for their contribution rather than being treated as a burden to be shifted to someone else. And for the common European asylum system at large, it will bring the emphasis where, in my view, it should be, on the solidarity and on the mutual trust between member states. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and also to any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Tihomir, for this very, very informative presentation of this very important research. In MedMA, we know how difficult it has been to be able to secure this sample, and we always have to have this in mind when we're designing such kind of research, that talking to people that are on a second stage of an asylum claim, people are very reluctant. They sometimes are confused when researchers come up to talk to them. So I'm saying a lot because on a research protocol level, it has been very challenging. We know that, and it has been very important that we were able to, bypass all the problems to have a representative sample and have these very interesting results. I already have received some questions, and apologies for not mentioning earlier. Please make sure that you mention in the question if you address it to a specific panelist or to everybody, although everybody will have the chance, of course, to comment afterwards. I'm just saying that if you want to address it to someone specifically, just make sure you put it on your comment. You can use the chat section or the Q&A section. But before we go there, I would like to give the floor first to Kristin Fabbe. Dear Kristin, who is the chair in Business and Comparative Politics in the Florence School of Transnational Governments at EUI. So, Kristin, we would love your commentary on everything you've heard. We know that you have been working on integration in Greece for several years, so you might have things to add there, but also on an EU perspective, including what is coming next with the EU Pact on Migration and Asylum. So the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Eleni, Marco, EPLO, MedMA, and Tihomir. Thank you so much for putting together this excellent research, which, like much of your research, I read with great interest when this report came out. So it's really excellent to see you present it here today. I think the work does a number of things that are really important for pushing the discussion about migration governance forward, particularly this important time when the pact is really being implemented, consolidated, and for hopefully in the minds of many formally operationalized. So I think you do a few things in this work that really should draw our attention. So the first is urging people to think about the entire life cycle of mobility rather than just the first asylum application. I think really thinking in this kind of more medium and long term in the entire life cycle of mobility gives us a lot of insight into what are the types of measures, legislative and otherwise, that we might need to have in place to think about common and solidarity-oriented responses to movements, secondary, tertiary, and other. The second thing I think you do in this report, which is really nice, is the focus on reception conditions and also a bit of a pushback on this literature that's come out, which is really emphasizing the importance of order. So there's so much literature coming out these days in academia, which is basically saying, if you just make the asylum system and process much more orderly, and everything is perfectly ordered, then people will be willing to accept more asylum seekers, and migration will become less polarized, and we'll all go back to a world in which migration is a second and third order concern for people. And I think what this work is doing is forcing us to think about, well, you can still impose a lot of order on the asylum and reception system, as they've done in the Greek case very recently, and still get some quite bad outcomes when it comes to integration and long-term prospects for societal engagement for those who arrive in these countries. So you've seen a lot of order imposed on the reception system, but the reception conditions don't seem particularly good. And I think this is also a really solid contribution to another set of literatures that show that's actually in organizational and management studies, which have now started to look at the question of migration governance, and they use the life cycle approach. And one of the things that they have struck upon is that this first point of meeting between anybody who arrives and a receiving country, that very first point of meeting sets the stage for subsequent behavior. And this is pretty common in organizational studies, to understand that people's experience in that first point of meeting goes on to condition a lot of the ways they think about moving through systems. But here I think you're giving us a great example of that. You're also pushing back against this, we must just make order and control everywhere, because we also see, I think in this work, that even if you grant people asylum and you have an orderly system, they still might decide to go somewhere else. And so that brings us to sort of larger questions, which I think you lay out really nicely in this work, about misconceptions around push and pull factors. I think you give us a lot of material to work with there. The misconceptions about the mechanisms through which those things work. I think that's really excellent. And then I think, the report leads us to bigger questions. I think three of the ones that you raised that I see as really the most important are, what do we learn from the Temporary Protection Directive? What did that teach us? I think there is more to be said there and more to be contributed on that specific point. I think the second point I would make is that just this emphasis on adequate integration support. So it's probably not a mystery to people who are in the audience of this call, but going through the hoops in the Greek system is something that, I don't envy anybody who's in that position, having been there a few times in a couple of cases myself. The system is not particularly responsive, hospitable, or accommodating. It's also very, very difficult. And Greece doesn't have some of the natural luxuries like Spain does, for instance, in integrating people from Latin America into the labor market so smoothly because of language differences and otherwise. So there are also some structural factors which make integration in Greece difficult. But what I hear coming out of some of the stories that your respondents are telling us, and also congratulations on getting this sample, because it is not easy indeed to talk to these people, but I think it's critical. I think something also needs to be said about the role of labor conditions in adequate integration support. So if we're dealing with a place where labor conditions are just quite simply so poor, some of your respondents state that they leave after being employed and not being paid for 4 or 5 months. So for those of us who are familiar with the Greek labor market, that doesn't seem so shocking. But you can imagine if you are in that position as a newcomer in the country, it doesn't give you a lot of faith and credibility. So I think there's really a role for the private sector to play as well in thinking about that adequate integration support and what that means in terms of labor market protections. Because if people don't see those protections right out of the gate, they will, if they're able to, they'll move on elsewhere. And then the last point I want to raise are points kind of that go to the issue of the pact. You mentioned the long-term residence directive and also the qualifications directive. We've got the solidarity mechanism and a number of things. And I think there are some super big questions about how these elements of the pact are actually going to work in practice. And in my conversations with the people who have been pushing the Common European Asylum System forward and really were behind the creation of the pact, The two places where I hear that they think there will be sticking points is on the border mechanism and on the solidarity mechanism. Those are the two places where I think people see the most potential for failure, for tension, and otherwise. And so I'd really hope that in this conversation we dig a little bit further into what does solidarity actually mean for frontline states. So what would frontline states actually want to see? How would they know solidarity if they saw it? And I wonder the same question for some of these northern states as well. So because solidarity to me, even in the pact, although there are some guardrails up there in the pact to make sure that solidarity is implemented, I have the sense that solidarity is also a bit of a feeling, that things are working in a way that's mutually beneficial. And I wonder, given the tenor of this piece, how much time is spent around discussions about secondary movements, bargaining and negotiation about people who have been engaged in secondary movements. There's so much diplomatic space spent on this issue. I wonder if some of these issues were channeled into more productive discussions about legal reform that were more long-lasting, what that might mean for the migration governance system writ large. So let me leave it there. Sorry, I tend to talk maybe too much, but I really enjoyed this presentation, and I'm looking forward to the next set of comments as well.
Thank you so much, Kristin, for raising all these points. And this was I also don't want to take advantage of my role, but this known feeling of solidarity we have seen like the past 3 months with the ongoing discussion about the solidarity, putting about the back and forth. I wanted to raise this point as well, but I'll just keep waiting for my place when it comes to the Q&A section. But this is a very important parameter as well as the all the integration turmoil in Greece and the link also to the labor mobility and all these agreements, the discussion, like being very, very much anchored towards labor mobility and also towards, the integration prospects of asylum seekers and all that. So I think this is a very interesting part of the discussion that we're going to have after the first round of interventions. But before we go into that, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Markus Engler, who's a researcher at the German Center for Integration and Migration, the DeZIM. Markus, thank you for being here. We would like your comment as well. We know that you've been working also with Tiho on the nudging forward conceptualization, if I may, of onwards movement, as you know, a responsibility shifting strategy put forward by the Greek state. We have been trying to assess secondary onwards movements more on the basis of, the actual aspirations of people through research. So I just wanted your comment on whether there is complementarity to these approaches, or what, if you have heard anything new from our policy brief, and also if you may, an overview of what's going on in Germany, since you're based there, like if the discussion there would also be, worthwhile, or anything you want to comment.
Yes, Eleni, thank you very much for having me, and I'm happy to share some observations on the study, but also on the political context. So yeah, it's an important new piece of research complementing other studies that are already there, and we can see very clearly, right? There's this complexity of factors that shape movements, aspirations, and also actual movements. And while we often criticize political accounts, that kind of overemphasize the impact of policies, the opposite would also be wrong, right? So saying that policies don't matter. We can very clearly see in the research Tiho has presented that they do matter, and also they can be changed. The question is obviously then, what would be kind of the right incentive structures for governments to adopt a different policy. As you already mentioned, Tiho and I have recently published a piece in which we quite straightforwardly, I would say, can show that this kind of nudging forward strategy is an intentional political strategy invented and implemented by the current Greek government with the aim of pushing people out, right? And when we can see in the research that it's to some extent working. This is obviously not new. I mean, the debates about secondary movements and the lack of solidarity within the EU has been addressed in research and also in the political debates many times. But what we are seeing here, and this is what we are showing in the article, is that there are different kind of ways of doing it, different strategies. And here, I mean, in the current Greek case, it works like this. I mean, there are fast asylum procedures, very often resulting in a positive decision. So then, that's why we are talking about the beneficiaries of international protection. They also get relatively quickly, travel documents. And at the same time, once they are, accepted as a refugee, or having a status, protection status, access to, support structures, plus also to the labor market is very difficult. So this is one part of the strategy, and we can say it's a strategy because it has been framed like this more or less also by Greek politicians. And on the other hand, part of the strategy is also to make returns of those people very difficult or even impossible. I mean, this can also be done, in different ways. I mean, on the one hand, there's a legal component, but also, I mean, simply by non-cooperating. And this is obviously not only Greece, right? Italy also is taking almost 0 people back, asylum seekers, and also other people from Germany. So, while I'm now criticizing, what the Greek policy looks like, but of course, we have to see and understand this in the broader context of, as Ticho also said, an unresolved, long-lasting structural conflict within the EU. As I mean, maybe we have time a bit later. Already mentioned. I mean, there are different ways of for different countries to react to this. I mean, obviously, other strategies by frontline states is simply non-registration of asylum seekers, or even facilitating onward movement in different ways. Not taking people back. So this is nothing new. What is new is this specific form I just explained in the Greek context. And obviously, other countries like Germany and the Netherlands, obviously, and others, they're not happy with this. The open letter by some of the ministries has been mentioned already. Those kind of receiving countries, and Germany as well, they are reluctant, and actually, I mean, accepting those people and giving them another asylum procedure and then access to integration and so on and so forth. But I mean, they have been forced to do so by court decisions. That said, okay, you cannot return those people. Situations in Greece are inhumane, degrading. So please do another asylum procedure. And this has been, I mean, this hasn't been straightforward. I mean, it's a long process, and people are losing time, as Ticho rightly mentioned. But then, for some time, this has been working. But then, obviously, the German government and other governments as well, they are working on strategies, to stop this. So they engage in strategic litigation. They, I don't have time to explain kind of the whole story, but obviously they don't like this, and they find ways in making it more difficult. Now, I mean, in the German context, we've seen important rulings saying that, I mean, those people, I mean, beneficiaries of international protection in Greece can actually be returned, but only some of them, like men in working age. They're working on also on other people as well, right? But so far, as far as I've seen it, it's legally not. I mean, courts haven't allowed, the German governments to do this. But I mean, there's a broader political debate, right? It's, I mean, as you probably know, there's been also a restrictive shift in German asylum policies. I mean, we have border controls at the German borders, even with pushbacks of asylum seekers. There are all kinds of very hard restrictions in the pipeline, and courts are challenging those. For instance, I mean, one of the ideas is obviously to reduce social benefits to zero, for I mean, asylum seekers or also beneficiaries of international protection. So all of this is a political game where, different states try to avoid responsibility. I mean, will this now change with the new the new common European asylum system? I don't think we can assume this automatically. Many policymakers would claim, okay, now we have a new system, it's in order, everything, will be solved. I'm very skeptical. Obviously we need to wait and see. But what we've already seen, there's the solidarity mechanism, and I mean, Germany somehow engaged, and it's also already been mentioned in negotiations, bilateral negotiations with Greece and Italy, and all of those are completely in transparent. So we don't know what's being actually negotiated there. But we know that, I mean, Germany accepted, to do no more kind of returns of asylum seekers to Greece until June, I guess. And in the same time, not doing relocations, and counting those people. That's called offset, the so-called offset mechanism, counting those people that move on their own, as a German contribution, right? But beneficiaries of international protection are not included in this deal. And of course, we don't know. We don't know, has this been discussed? Why is it not there? But I totally agree with Ticho that this could certainly be a mechanism of solving this political conflict. I mean, of course, we can talk about asylum seekers, but also beneficiaries of international protection. We absolutely don't know whether this will happen, right? We just have to wait and see. I just talked this morning to someone from the German Ministry of Internal Affairs, and it's also, I mean, they also said, sometimes what frontline member states want is not relocation. Maybe they want money or other things. And I mean, connecting it, I'm coming to an end. Connecting, all of this is where we have a very strong alignment of interest between all EU states, is this kind of very huge agenda of externalization, right? That's where everybody agrees. But I mean, also here, I don't expect, a lot of progress. So this question of intra-EU responsibility sharing will always remain a super important topic, both as a reality for people moving, but also as, if the numbers of newly arriving people will increase again, also as a political issue. So I'm quite sure, and I leave it there for the moment.
Thank you so much, Markus, for the comments. I think, there are so many things that we do not know, and these things are even, much bigger when it comes to beneficiary of international protection, exactly because, apart from the lack of transparency of how negotiations come, there's also this issue of this happening in the Schengen area, actually. So we know there is a bigger monitoring. We see it when we all land in, in German airports, but at the same time, we don't know how many people are actually returned. We hear numbers, we don't know the exact numbers. And of course, just with another parameter, we don't know how many people that are returned can, leave Greece as well for Germany or for tertiary onwards movement. So this is a situation that, it's so non-transparent and at the same time has so many political repercussions in what we're discussing, which I think, merits more research. So I think from what I hear, it's a good thing that we did the research. So this is for sure, and this is something that we have to get forward more. I'm very aware of the time, so I would not take advantage of my role. My proposal is that I have gathered. Sorry, I'm looking all screens because I'm gathering the comments and questions from all channels. So my proposal is that I read through the questions and the comments, and then we have another round of interventions so that we can have everything, we can have enough time, like 5 to 7 minutes each, so that we have enough time to have everything answered. If that's okay with you, I will try to address them to the person addressed, but please feel free to comment, all of you. So I'll start with a couple of questions that I have for Tihomir. I tried to make a grouping that have to do with mostly research protocol. The one is whether you believe the data would be different if the sample would be larger or more focused on migrant communities with historical ties with the Netherlands. Um, Again, assumptions, but maybe you have an idea already of whether there would be something different. And the other is an interesting question, the legal status of the respondents in the Netherlands. So you said that they were disappointed to find out about the length of the asylum procedure. Does this mean they were all in the asylum procedure? Would the results be different if some of them would be recognized in the Netherlands? So these are two questions that are pertain more to the actual methodology, and also a question regarding the recommendations. Sorry, two questions regarding the recommendation because I have my own and I'll take advantage of my role here. So one is in the report you mentioned recasting the long-term residence directive as a realistic and viable policy option. Is this enough to curb onward movement? Is there a danger that even after granting long-term residence, the structural factors would still generate onward movement? So this is one. And the second, again, for everybody, if I may, is one of the recommendations that we made in the report, and we have been discussing that with Markus and the team here, is about the problem caused with this 30-day rule. So the 30-day rule about reception material support being lifted after 30 days, so people having essentially to leave the camp after 30 days. So I mean, this is something that I see as a recommendation both to the Greek state, but at the same time to the EU in a way, in the sense that it also has to do with the eligibility of the funding. It's not on just or is it, maybe I'm wondering, just a choice of the Greek state, or something that would also create eligibility issues when it comes to the funding, because people that would be beneficiaries of international protection would not be eligible from the AMIF fund to stay in the camp, and what would that mean if this policy was to change? So this is a group of questions. For Markus, I have a similar question that I received, whether a similar research would make sense in Germany, and what similarities and differences would you anticipate in such a research? And finally, a question for Kristin, and everybody again. It has to do with the pact and all the negotiations on the solidarity mechanism and the lack of solidarity, or however you call it. We have been seeing the discussions for the solidarity pool going on for months, and then we have had this decision that Markus also mentioned about this offsetting of responsibility between the Greek and Italian and German state. So the German state would keep what they already have, and they would not take any relocation, just to put it a bit bluntly. And I was wondering whether you feel this could affect the dynamics of secondary movements in any way, like people feeling more or less inclined to move onwards because of this kind of bilateral agreements and understanding between states. So this is what I have until now. Before I go, I propose we keep the same order. So I can go to Tihomir, then Kristin, then Markus. But before that, Markus, do you want to jump in for any thoughts?
I think there's I only have one point. I think this is very important. The point on fighting against the compartmentalization of thinking of the migrant trajectory, let me put it thus. That also involves labeling, the idea that you arrive and you are, someone who arrives in the country, and then you apply and you're an asylum applicant, and then you're recognized, and then you're a refugee, and somehow this is different labels or different lived experiences that, are sort of decontextualized. And the truth of the matter is, the points made in the research on reception informing decision making as a refugee. So based on your experiences and what I think Kristin said is very interesting on the first point of connection of welcome. I mean, it makes perfect sense in terms of the research out there on the fluidity of decision making, on migrant agency, on the ambiguity of the journey. We've had people do research on that, but when it comes to even the structure of ministries, there's the idea that your asylum claim is handled by X service, and then when it comes to your integration, it's handled by another service, which is fine, but it sharpens and it amplifies distinction between the various stages of the journey. But then after all, they all come back to inform migrant agency and decision on onward movement. And I think that's very interesting, because the assumption was that it's the lack of support. And the idea that it's also adverse reception conditions, it raises for me a point that I've made in the past. So the camps on the Greek islands are Schrödinger's camps. They have to be bad enough to constitute a deterrent effect, but at the same time, they have to be good enough not to generate onward movement. So the idea is that, there's a discussion about deterrence, but then deterrence also works towards generating secondary movement. And I think this is a conundrum which policymakers have to deal with. But I leave it here. There's questions to answer, but overall, thank you very much.
Thank you, Markus, again for linking us applied physics with our discussion here in policy. So let me give the floor to Tihomir. So we have like 7-8 minutes each. I assume we have enough time to address everything. Tihomir, hopefully. Tihomir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for all the questions. I think I want to start with drawing on some experience I have from another research project. I study the experience of people who are received in the closed controlled access centers on the Greek islands. And I have interviewed dozens of people there, repeatedly, people who lived there for a few months or for a longer period, moved forward, went to Athens, Thessaloniki, settled in Greece, or the majority of them went abroad. It is important to think about what Kristin said here and think about the entire journey of the people and their entire experience more holistically, the same point that Markus just finished with. The first point of interaction, the first impression that Kristin highlighted as very important, and it is something impulsive, it's something that we all know, but I haven't looked at this literature that she referred to, probably I have to. The first point of interaction with the Greek reception system is the so-called quarantine at the moment. The first few days of restriction of movement, restriction of liberty, where people are processed, so-called border procedure. And all the adversities that I mentioned in my previous intervention, most of them refer to these initial days where people would be hosted in a collective facility, sleep on the ground, having no safety, having common wash facilities, really bad conditions. So this obviously is very important. When it comes to what Markus said, to what extent this would deter them or nudge them forward, well, from my experience from all these interviews, it seems that it does not deter them, and it does partially nudge them forward. We should not be absolute, we should not be a polity, as we say in Greek, because not all people would leave Greece after their given protection. There are people who would travel to Athens, who would travel to islands, who would try to settle in Greece, and some of them would succeed. Hence, we call it nudging. It is not absolute, and we should recognize that. And thinking about the entire route, we should also think about the consequences of political decisions in Greece on this entire route. So it seems to me from all this data collection I've been done in the last couple of years that the policies in Greece have changed the dynamics in the entire route. Some people plan their journey having saved less financial resources because they know how much the journey to Greece would cost them. And they plan for living in a Greek reception center for a couple of months, for example. Some of them would enter into a trap potentially because their asylum decision would not come so quickly. For instance, if the decision for Syrians has been frozen. However, think about how this impacts people decision making before they go to Greece, right? Also think about how it impacts the dynamic of the entire route after. If you were trapped in Greece and you needed to wait for a couple of years for your asylum decision, it is likely that you would turn to a smuggler that would help you go to Western Europe if you want to go there. So what the Greek policy does in this sense is taking the bread out of the mouth of smugglers that existed on this route for a while. Not all of them, but at least some of them. So think about what you need in this respect. You need some kind of travel agency, let's say, because people have documents, can travel regularly. So what they need basically is a bank account to book their ticket to Germany or the Netherlands. They usually don't have such a bank account. So someone needs to provide these services. You understand how the entire route, the entire dynamic from aspirations, from assumptions, from perception, everything changes. And that's very important to understand and not to underestimate, what happens in one country is only an issue related to this country or to what happens afterwards. It also impacts what happens beforehand. When it comes to the question that you had on what happens to people when they arrive to the Netherlands, well, some of them would get protection eventually after a very long time of waiting. Some of them would be lucky and get protection early on. Some of them would travel to different countries. There are cases they would go to Germany, apply. They would be assessed as inadmissible. Then they would move to the Netherlands. They would apply. They would receive protection. There are very, complicated legal issues involved in these matters. Depends on the country of origin. Depends on many things. But this essentially wouldn't change the dynamic if the person has decided to leave Greece. The person would simply look for a destination where they could rebuild their life. If we increase the sample on your question, and if we look for, let's say, dynamics within certain migrant communities and how this may impact their decision making, I am sure that we would have some novel findings. Nevertheless, I'm also sure that these novel findings are not going to be in contradiction to what we have already found. I think that they will be just an addition to what we have presented already in the report. And when it comes to the recommendations, I think that on the one hand, what is missing is obviously political will. And if we have political will, we have seen in the past that it is a matter of administrative creativity, which is not lacking, to be honest, how people can be allowed to move from one member state to another. And the other things that we mentioned, like the recast of the long-term residence directive, they are logical steps, in my opinion, in the longer term, that would lead to what essentially is laid down in primary European law and what should be the logical end in terms of mutual trust between member states and common European asylum system, which is mutual recognition of positive asylum decisions. Of course, we can think about this in the distance of 10, 20 years, but these steps, like changes in the European level legal instruments and then the national ones, are logical steps to this direction. They are complicated, but they can be done in combination with these political steps that we just mentioned. And for the 30-day rule, yes, this was the most highly consequential one, in my opinion, because it creates enormous stress in the people immediately after they receive protection. It's like a blessing and a curse to get a protection, because it's the most desired thing that can happen to one. And then at the same time, the thing that immediately puts you in a situation of immediate risk of precarity. So for those people, usually this was the reason which led them sooner or later to fall into this trap of being unable to find stable housing, stable job, etc., and leave the country. And indeed, there are different things that can be done there, in combination, of course, with addressing the shortcomings of the reception system, and funding is part of these solutions, of course. I don't know if I forget something, but we can return to it later.
I think you've covered everything, with most important being that the common European asylum system has to become common at some point. If I try to sum up, thank you for addressing all the comments. So I'll give the floor to Kristin, but before that, we have another question that came in. So I'm just trying to make sure that we can answer as many as we can. So I'm putting it right here. If reception conditions impact secondary movements to Greece, would you argue that returns to Greece could or are impacted by the reception conditions in the place of secondary movements? I'm alluding to a potential policy incentive to create deterrence in both directions. So interesting as well. Kristin, your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks very much, Eleni, and thanks again for this interesting discussion. I think I might need you to repeat that question because it sounded quite provocative. The policy instrument sounded a bit provocative, but I don't think I caught the last bit because you cut out for a second. So could you repeat that?
Yes, if you also you have an access to the Q&A, so this is a written one. You can check it there as well.
Great.
Because
Sorry, I do have access to that.
Yeah, so but
there we go.
I'm reading again for the people that are watching. If reception conditions impact secondary movements to Greece, would you argue that returns to Greece could or are impacted by the reception conditions in the place of secondary movements? I'm alluding to a potential policy incentive to create deterrence in both directions. So I think it also has to do with a bit with the Schrödinger's can be the sense that maybe, if I understand correctly, but whoever posed the question, feel free to type here more insights.
Okay, great. Thank you, Eleni. That's really helpful. Thanks for that clarification, and indeed an interesting and provocative question. So I guess I just wanted to pick up, Eleni, directly on your question about the solidarity mechanism and offsetting, and what we think what effect we think this might have on some of the dynamics of secondary movements. And I think the question that just came in speaks also to that point. In some ways, and then I'll also try to touch on a few of the things that were alluded to in the previous set of comments. So, I'm not sure. I think this research is pointing us into an important set of directions where we really look at the major consequences of what we might think of as like micro rules. So we think of things like not being able to open a bank account or the 30-day rule. These are some of the sort of perilous turning points in the beneficiary of international protection's journey that that seem to have major consequences on whether or not secondary movements are happening. And I think that and then we have this like broader level that's at the sort of the diplomatic level, where it's quite simply like a game of horse trading, where people are trying to offset responsibilities and quote unquote burdens and get to this elusive point of achieving solidarity. And I just wonder, I guess my initial response to that question would be that certainly I think this policy will be, this will be consequential in some ways, but I think it's very difficult to predict what the trickle-down effects of this might be. Let's say, even if people on the move understand this, I mean, I think that's even a stretch. And whether or not they think they will be affected by it, or whether or not they're going to be subject to misinformation, as we read in some of the other points of the research, I think are really important. And here we have a policy communications issue. So even if this the offset, the responsibility offset, kind of helps to enforce this mandatory but flexible solidarity, it is a bit of a sleight of hand at the diplomatic level. I mean, let's just think about what happened here. So effectively, there was some very creative and clever administrative nudging, and I like that term very much, that kind of nudged people in a certain direction to do a certain set of things. And Okay, and there were other nudging strategies as well that didn't apply to beneficiaries of international protection, but just through non-registration and all of the things that have been alluded to in this conversation. And then we get this nice big architecture for the pact, and then we have northern states, and in particular Germany in this case, coming in and saying, well, okay, solidarity, great, but we've already done our part. And so we already done our part when you did your administrative sleight of hand. So there's kind of two sleights of hand happening in the diplomatic space. And I just wonder, do people on the move, I don't think people on the move really think about that. I think people that are on the move are thinking about things like, can I open a bank account? Where am I going to go in the next 30 days? And so it's really difficult to say how some of these diplomatic turns are going to shape the migrants' perspective. So I think that's really hard to predict. One thing I would hope that it could get us to, though, if this is the direction in which things are going to go, is like if we're going to be shuttling a lot of people around on planes to get the solidarity system in shape, and we're going to have to do all sorts of takebacks and all sorts of offsets. I just wonder if, a lot of these could actually be done on paper in a way that just kind of eases the burden of secondary movements, because we also have this massive problem of returns, which we know are impossible to execute at scale. And are a bit of a facade fiction in the entire migration governance system. So I think the last thing that policymakers want to do is burden themselves with another set of kind of performative diplomatic negotiations that are super costly, but for the migrant and for the migrant's journey, the outcomes matter, but that whole diplomatic horse trading process matters, is very, very divorced from the migrant experience. So I think that's my way of kind of tying together some of the things that are happening at the structural level, and then some more of these micro factors. And I think what I would just urge is that a focus on these micro factors is actually super important, which is why I think this research is pretty path breaking, and we need to think a little bit more in this direction. Now, to the respondent's question about whether or not you can get incentives to create deterrence in both directions, I guess I wonder what are you basically saying that we should degrade reception conditions in Germany so that people are not pulled to go to Germany? I guess to that question, I would respond with something that is a little bit tongue in cheek, and it sounds quite negative, but it's something a student said to me, which was, and it gets, I think, to Markus's point about the Schrödinger's camps, is that to what extent do you want to degrade your own systems to make them unappealing to outsiders? So how scared of you are outsiders, to outsiders, that you're willing to degrade your own systems to such an extent that maybe one day you'll be subjected to those own systems that you've now degraded so that somebody else doesn't find them appealing? And I think in this particular moment in time politically, when institutions are being degraded right, center, and left, it's probably, thinking about deterrence. I understand that that's an important part of the policy equation, but I would hope that we don't get, a pile-on of deterrence, which is effectively really just a race to the bottom institutionally for all of these things around integration. Because I think if there's one country that knows it quite well, if you fail at the integration in round one, in generation 3 and 2, you're also going to be having a pretty difficult time. The Turkish labor migrants to Germany are a case in point. So let me leave it there.
Thank you so much, Kristin, and thank you for reminding us that upholding decent living conditions are essentially upholding the rule of law in our community. It's not just a technical term. So I'll pass the floor to Markus for his comments and replies.
Yeah, I mean, I can very well connect. I mean, it's a super interesting question, right? How might this kind of solidarity mechanism, and then also, I mean, including offsets, how might this affect future, decision making? I guess that's a very difficult question to answer, because I mean, I would say if, we would have kind of a stable pattern there, like Germany kind of offsetting each and every year 10 or 20,000 cases. Okay, this would have an impact somehow. But also then again, we cannot see this in isolation, because I mean, we already had, I don't like the term secondary movements, but let's call it onward movements. And we always had this, despite already having a very restrictive system in place, right? Also in the past. And what we are seeing now is that states try to make the system even more restrictive at all ends, to control kind of the mobility of protection seekers, even with more drastic measures. So then really it would also, depend not only on the question if do we have this offsetting on a regular basis, but also how is it, administered? I mean, who is at what time, and I mean, but I'm sure those questions are already, addressed in ministries, thinking about how to communicate it. And I mean, so far the numbers we have seen were fairly small. I mean, the first round, like a couple of thousand, right? 4,000, 5,000, something like this for Germany. So yeah, I mean, I guess we need more research, but I guess it will not have maybe such a big impact. And on the issue of, making yourself unattractive, I mean, this is also a well-established strategy by European states. And then it really depends also how the European Commission will really make use of its mandate, meaning, to really make sure that European law is implemented and respected, which is not the case, has never been the case, at least not fully. I mean, but especially the last couple of years, there was always this argument, okay, there are ongoing negotiations, we don't even have the capacities, we don't even have the people to make sure that, certain countries comply with EU law. But I mean, in the solidarity mechanism, there is this part where you can only get solidarity from other countries if you are prepared, and this you are not considered as being prepared if you have a completely dysfunctional system. So in principle, this is also a positive thing. But then, it's probably something for game theoretical scholars, right? I mean, what are you doing? Are you kind of just degrading your system and hoping people will continue leaving, and very few will be returned? Or are you trying to play by the game? And here again, this is what Tihomir said. I mean, this is a political game, which we can only understand if you look at all or most of the actors. It's not only Germany and Greece. And I guess there's this whole rhetoric of a fresh start. And you hear policymakers, and even if I'm criticizing a lot of what they're doing, what they're saying, I mean, some of them really hope, okay, there will be a new system, a new and to some extent a better system, right? But then there's also what Tihomir mentioned, this question of mutual trust. And this mutual trust has been completely lost over the last couple of years, right? So, I mean, countries not cooperating in the Dublin system, for instance, right? So will this change? Will states start playing by the rules again? I'm really skeptical, really. But I mean, they have to put the cards on the table pretty soon, right? So we'll find out. And maybe I didn't make this clear enough while I was obviously, criticizing the Greek government for such a strategy. Of course, they do this because they are, part of a very unfair and very kind of badly designed system, right? Everybody knows this, and there have been all kinds of debates about relocation and so on. Some of the things worked at least partially, but yeah, I mean, they do this because they're in this kind of bad position, this bad system. And I mean, how can things change? It's first of all, I mean, this has been said before. I mean, not to understand refugees and protection seekers as a burden. We know, I mean, if people arrive and all of those systems, they come with financial costs, but I mean, those are human beings, and if you treat them well, if you give them opportunities, they are not a burden, right? I mean, but it's not the narratives that we are seeing on the one hand. On the other hand, demographic aging in all European states, maybe there might be also some, some change coming. But it's not, automatic. It's not. Yeah. We have to push for it and see. Then there was this question of, if we do the same research in Germany, would we find the same things? I would say pretty much similar things. I was actually surprised, right? When I talked to Ticho first about it and also reading a report that this kind of family or community kind of link played such a little role. This might, I mean, this can be maybe partially be explained by, I mean, people coming from which countries of origin. If it's Syrians, obviously many would have links to Germany, and but this yeah, maybe also those people with closer links already moved before the asylum procedure. But then again, I mean, it's complicated migratory pathways, right? In Germany, as I said, adopting this very restrictive policy change and also kind of closing family reunification, for instance, right? I mean, all of this has impacts then of who will, maybe be forced to use different channels. So yeah, I'm obviously calling for more research, and a bigger sample to repeat it. Also, maybe a cross-country comparison that would be definitely interesting. Yeah, I guess those are the most important points.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Markus. And I think we have a consensus on the need for more research. Also, I'm full disclosure, have been discussing with Markus like forever, that our ideal research would be like the link between rejected reunification cases and the onwards movements of people that were rejected, that their family reunification claim was rejected to an onward movement, to see, how people are actually engaged and have an agency, and once they set their minds to do something, they may very much well be able to do so in a way or another. So we are also again working just FYI on narratives a lot, on trying to on MedMA, because this loss of trust that you have been mentioning and the subsequent toxicity that we see in the public dialogue about migration in general is one thing for granted, but at the same time we see that from the research that we're also trying to pilot, that if we keep this balance between control and compassion, then we can have more open ears to our messaging, which is something also very important. Before I close and thank you all, I would like just to give the floor to Tihomir, who is the central figure of our webinar, if he wants to make a final comment.
I just want to thank Kristin and Markus for their comments, and also to everyone who found the time today to listen to our findings and found our research interesting. And I want to say that, to me, it boils down to two options in the end of the day. Either we are going to continue keeping our head in the sand and we'll continue with the same situation that we are into, which is harmful for BIPs, harmful for taxpayers, harmful for social cohesion, harmful for the trust between member states, or we are going to realistically and pragmatically sit on the table collectively, and then we are going to find eventually a solution to this, which is not a big issue. Last 5 years, we have 112,000 recognized refugees in Greece in 5 years. That was it.
Thank you so much. I could not sum it up better. So thank you everybody from our part in MedMA as well. Thank you, Kristin. Thank you, Markus, for joining. Thank you, Tihomir, for this exceptional collaboration, and everybody that was here today. Just to give you a heads up of what we're doing in MedMA for 1 minute. I'm quite aware of time. So one thing that we would like to share is that we are now fully operational in Cyprus as well with our policy officer there. So we are also watching the Cypriot presidency that will eventually cut the ribbon of the pact in June. So this will be an interesting months ahead. And we will be holding our first open event in March, mostly focused on integration. So we will all keep you posted. And then on the labor mobility part that we are also working in MedMA, the second week of March, we'll keep you posted. We are holding an event in Athens to discuss the 2 implementation review policy papers that we have produced, the one on the Greece-Egypt seasonal work agreement and another on the Greece-Bangladesh MOU on labor mobility. So both are published on the website. And we're planning an event on the second week of March. We will send you save the date ASAP when we have the final date. So these are all from us. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here and for this great discussion.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you.